Hi there, and welcome to an internet model of the insular cortex, part 1a. First of all, you might want to check the previous video, which can be found on the address given on the screen, or alternatively check the TAWOP 2008 channel, which is spelt TAWOP 2008. So why develop a model of the insular cortex? Well, the insular cortex is an interesting part of the brain that hasn't been as well researched as a number of other brain regions. What seems to be emerging is that the insular cortex is actually playing quite an important role in the brain. Thus there is evidence that it has a role in bringing together the sensations and emotions we experience. The insular cortex is also being associated with a number of illnesses, and so a better understanding of its role could be of benefit. Historically also, the insular cortex is interesting. It was first named Reil's cortex after Johann Christian Reil, who, as well as identifying this part of the brain, was also the father of modern psychiatry. So here is a schematic cross-section through the brain. Imagine that you're facing a person, and then imagine cutting a slice through the brain as you're facing head-on, just in front of the ear, roughly. This is the schematic representation of what you would see if you did that. Moving first of all to the outer surface, we have the cortex in red. Tracing it round on the convex surface, and now we have the insular cortex. If you were looking from the side, you wouldn't be able to see it immediately. You'd have to move the other parts of the cortex out of the way. Here we have the claustrum next to the insula. This is a very mysterious part of the brain. Francis Crick, the co-discoverer of DNA, has suggested this is the seat of consciousness, as it has widespread connections throughout the brain. Here is the lentiform nucleus, which is a lens-shaped structure containing the putamen and globus pallidus, which form part of the basal ganglia which is involved in movement. Here is the thalamus, which passes connections between lots of areas, and in some senses is a relay station, but there is actually some evidence that it processes information as well. So there were 3 studies that gave me an idea for this model of the insula. This is the first one by Cameron and colleagues in the Archives of General Psychiatry in 2007, and they were looking at Gaba receptors in the brains of people with panic attacks and comparing them with people without. They were looking in particular at a neurotransmitter called Gaba. So first of all, what is a Gaba receptor and what is Gaba? Well, the brain is made up of lots of building blocks called neurons that are very tiny. They connect to each other and pass information through their connections. If the first neuron passes information to the second neuron, we call the first neuron the presynaptic neuron, and the second neuron the postsynaptic neuron, which is blue in the diagram. Now, when the neurons pass information to each other, they use chemical messengers called neurotransmitters. One of these neurotransmitters is called GABA. There is a special type of receptor called a Gaba receptor which acts like the lock where GABA is the key. So first of all, the GABA is released from the presynaptic neuron. It then binds to the GABA receptor, opening it and allowing negatively charged chloride ions to pass through. Chlorine is part of table salts and added to water in swimming pools to keep them clean because of its bleaching properties. So it's a chemical that people come across in everyday life. The chloride enters the postsynaptic neuron and makes it negatively charged on the inside. This makes it more difficult to fire effectively, inhibiting this neuron. At the same time, the GABA is then taken back up into the presynaptic neuron. Now this is a gross oversimplification, and there are sometimes other consequences when GABA reaches the postsynaptic neuron, but we won't consider those here. Now in this study, the authors used flumazenil, which is a compound that binds to part of the GABA receptor, which is also bound to by a class of drugs known as the benzodiazepines. So in this study, the flumazenil was radioactive. When it bound to the GABA receptor, it released ionizing radiation, which was picked up by a detector in the PET scanner. Now what the authors found was quite interesting. There was less activity in the insular cortex in people with panic attacks than in those without. There were a number of explanations for this. So first of all, there could have been less neurons with GABA receptors in the insula. Secondly, there could have been less GABA receptors on neurons in the insula. And thirdly, other compounds binding to GABA receptors in the insula. Now, before we go any further, I just want to refer to a Pulitzer Prize-winning book by Douglas Hofstadter called Gödel, Escher, Bach, An Eternal Golden Braid, which was published just under 30 years ago. In this book, Hofstadter suggested that Euclid's principles of geometry came about as a result of small individual steps in reasoning, which occur very quickly because the brain is so good at performing lots of calculations very quickly. So for the purposes of building this model, I've attempted to break it down into these very small steps, which I refer to as assumptions. The neat point about these assumptions is that they can easily be challenged, which we will need to do to improve the model. So, returning to the study, I've drawn two assumptions. The first assumption is that GABA A receptors are less available in the insular cortex in people with panic disorder. The second assumption is more contentious and goes beyond the study data, but helps with the model. That is that in panic disorder, there is a direct result of there being less GABA A receptor availability in the insular cortex. We'll now continue to the second video.